Well, hey there, learners. Niamh here, and this is the part 3 of my trying to solve a 100-year-old family mystery. And in this part, we're going to be covering the Four Helmers. Yes, there are other Helmers. And we're also going to be covering some information on DNA and what my thought process is going to be behind that. So, let's get started. So, the Four Helmers, as we know from the first video in this series, which I'll leave a card pop-up to, it was all about Helmer John or Elmer Bachman, who was born in 1886 in Linn County, Missouri, where my great-grandfather was born. And I, watched that video. It goes over all the information I have on him and why I think he's a very good candidate for being the potential father to Vernon Helmer Scott. There are actually other Helmers, and I don't want to put all my eggs in one basket, so I did want to cover some of the other Helmers here, and one of them I believe is actually a very good candidate, maybe just as good as Mr. Bachman here. But here are some of the other ones. One is Herbert Holmberg, who my dad found a while ago. Actually, he found a record of him, and we'll cover him in the next slide. And he was born around well, there's a question on his birth, which we'll cover in the next slide. And his ancestry, actually, I think his ancestry is Swedish, I believe. Maybe, when I made the slide, I forgot about that. But yes, he does have a Swedish background, but unknown descendants. And the third Helmer here is Helmer Henderson, born in 1890 in Jackson County, Missouri. And it truly does not, we don't have a known ancestry for him or known descendants. And finally, we have Hjalmer or Helmer Lindberg, and the Hjalmer is not AR. I made a mistake here, but it's ER. That's actually a more traditional spelling of Helmer. Yeah, well, he is very similar to Mr. Bachman here. He was also born in 1886, also in Linn County, Missouri, and I believe also in Buckland, Linn County, Missouri, which is where Mr. Bachman's family mostly lived, was in Buckland. This Helmer also has Swedish immigrant parents and many descendants, so in some ways he's actually even a little bit better of a candidate than Mr. Bachman, but yeah, but they're both very, very good candidates. So let's talk about Helmer Herbert Holmberg here, Helmer H. Holmberg. So we found a record here. Well, actually, is it this record? No, it's not this record. So we actually found a record. My dad found it, and then I later found it as well. And this record had stated that he was born in 1894, and this was Mr. Holmberg here. He was born in Chariton County, Missouri, and that's actually the same county that Edna was born in, so that was quite curious. And we were thinking this was a pretty good candidate. He would have been 2 years younger than Edna here, which, I mean, is still possible. Edna was 22 when she had Vernon, and so this Helmer would have been 20 when Vernon was born. So still very good idea here. And here he is listed with his family. His family are parents John and Hilma Holmberg or Holmberg, and as we can see here, they were from Sweden, where they were born, where their parents were born, etc. This Helmer had 4 brothers and 1 sister. So there's lots of descendants to go off of from there. And he was married to a Virginia May Harding with at least 1 child, a male. Now, the reason I call this a lost record, and it's not this one specifically, because this is actually one of the later ones we found. The reason I call this a lost record is because we cannot find this record again. It like disappeared. I don't know where it went. I saved it to our shoebox on Ancestry. That's something you can do on Ancestry.com. They have a shoebox where you can put records if you don't quite know where they fit yet, or you're not sure if it fits with your ancestor or whatever. You could put it in the shoebox and come back to it later. So I actually had the record for Mr. Holmberg being born in 1894 in the shoebox, and it also listed him as being married to Virginia May Harding. Now, like I said, I don't know where that record went. We've searched all over again. It's no longer in our shoebox. It's not anywhere. It's not even on FamilySearch.org. Because I had found it on both FamilySearch and Ancestry, and now it is missing from both. However, we found a lot of records, including this census record and other census records and death records and things like that for Helmer Herbert Holmberg. But they show that he was born in 1904 and born in Iowa, where the census records are from Sheridan County, Missouri. Later on, he was in Jackson County, Missouri, but he was born in Iowa in 1904. Now, if that's the case, which it seems to be, because all the other records seem to indicate that this Helmer was born in 1904, if that's the case, then he would have been 12 years old when Vernon Helmer Scott was born, and that just cannot be. So what I've gathered from this is that somehow that initial record we saw must have been incorrect, and maybe someone figured it out and pulled the record. I don't know. That's just a guess, because every single other record I'm finding on this Helmer Herbert Holmberg, married to Virginia May Harding, shows that he was born in 1904 in Iowa. So I am calling this one busted. Helmer Holmberg, I do not believe, is the father of Vernon Helmer Scott. I'm a little sad about that, because this was a record that my dad found, so I wanted there to be a strong validity for it. But all the records are showing that it's just not, I don't think it's possible that Helmer Holmberg is the father. So moving on, we have Helmer Henderson here, and so I found one record of Helmer Henderson, and this is the one who was from Jackson County. I'm sorry, I was saying Mr. Holmberg was, but Mr. Holmberg was from Sheridan County, and Mr. Henderson here is from Jackson County. All right, so getting all these Helmers confused, I swear. But anyway, so Helmer Henderson, this is one record that I have found for Helmer Henderson, and I cannot find any other record for this man. Now, in this record, he is born in 1890 in Missouri, which is, that would have made him 2 years older than Edna, which, is, right in the range there. It is listed on this census record that he is married. However, he's not actually living with his family in this record. This was a page 2 of 2 pages here, and at the bottom of this record was the rest of the household, and they were all of the surname Hayes. So he was lodging with this Hayes household in Jackson County, Missouri, when the census record was taken, and I'm not sure why. He is listed as being a roofer for a roofing company. Possibly he was doing some sort of work with them and living with them. I don't know. But it says that his parents, right here, his father was born in, actually I think this says Nebraska. So he was born in Missouri. His father was born in Nebraska, and his mother was born in Iowa. I made a little mistake there. I'm making all sorts of mistakes in this video here. Anyway, so it's really a question mark on this one because this is the only record I can find for him. Jackson County is a little bit further away from Lynn County, Missouri, so we can't really tell if Mr. Henderson here is a viable candidate, but there is a record of him, so it's possible. All right, so the big one here, Helmer August Lindberg. All right, so he was born in 1886 in Buckland, Lynn County, Missouri, and that's kind of huge because that is the same as Mr. Bachman, Helmer Bachman. He was also born in 1886 in Buckland, Lynn County, Missouri. So that's huge, actually. There were two Helmers from two different families born in the same year, same city, same county, all of that. So his parents, Mr. Lindberg, his parents were John August Lindberg and Anna Sophia Johansson, and they were born in the 1850s in Sweden, so we got a Swedish background here. They had, other than Helmer here, they had 3 sons and 2 daughters. And Helmer August Lindberg married Inez Alice Thiel in 1914. She was of a German background. Both of her parents were from Germany. And if you see 1914, that was the year that Vernon Helmer was born. So they got married after. If this Helmer is the father, then they got this couple married after he had the relationship with Edna. So they actually had 9 children together, 9 children with Inez here, and so that's great because there were many grandchildren, great-grandchildren, second great-grandchildren, etc., and I found some obituaries that listed some of the living descendants, and again, for here, I'm just putting the initials of the first name and the birth year because some of these people are actually still alive because, as you can see here, they were having children for 20 years. The oldest is 20 years older than the youngest here, so they were having children. Poor Inez here seemed to be constantly pregnant, but but that's good for my genealogical work because that means we've got a lot of descendants to work from here. And Helmer died in Adair County, Missouri in 1946. That was 4 years after Vernon Helmer Scott died. All right, so I think this is actually a very good candidate. It's very possible that Helmer August Lindberg is the father, and I think it's just as likely, if not even better, chances than Helmer John Bachman. So we'll have to see where it goes. So moving on from this is, like we said before, the main thing that's going to prove one way or the other is DNA. And so I wanted to talk about the types of DNA tests there are. So I made a little family tree here, a brother and sister, their parents, and their grandparents and great-grandparents. All right, so the first type of DNA test is autosomal, ATDNA. Now, this is what we see from companies like Ancestry, 23andMe, Family Tree DNA, MyHeritage. This is when someone says they're getting a sort of a heritage DNA test, pretty much what they're talking about is autosomal testing. And that is covering all of your recent ancestors, basically all of the DNA that you've gotten from your, I think it goes, you have up to like 7 or 8 generations of DNA still in you, potentially. So it can find up to like 5th, 6th cousins, maybe even 7th, but beyond that, we're we're not really sharing a whole lot of DNA, if any, with like our 8th, 9th, 10th cousins, so they're not really going to show up. And family tree DNA, FTDNA, their autosomal is called the family finder, because that's essentially what it is. You know, an autosomal test is connecting you with all of the DNA that you have, and that's also where you're getting the admixture, the ethnic heritage background from. It's looking at all of this and all of that DNA combined in your 23 pairs of chromosomes. So the main two companies is Ancestry and 23andMe, and I'm going to do a quick rundown of the differences between these companies. Ancestry is obviously the biggest one, Ancestry.com, and they have the biggest database by far out of all four companies, but they don't offer the Y-DNA or mitochondrial DNA like 23andMe and Family Tree DNA do, which I find very helpful, especially when we're trying to find an adoption mystery here. And there's other issues with Ancestry too. 23andMe, I believe, is actually more accurate than Ancestry, but it is a little bit smaller of a database. But 23andMe does give you a base level haplogroups Y and mitochondrial. Family Tree DNA, their autosomal test is pretty good, but they have a much smaller database, a much smaller customer base, so less likely chance that you're going to find relatives there. And MyHeritage is the newest company, and I believe it does have some connections with Family Tree DNA. I believe the Family Finder is actually the same thing as MyHeritage's autosomal test. Correct me if I'm wrong. But anyway, so MyHeritage is like the cheapest out of all four of them, but a lot of that is because they have a much smaller customer base, way smaller than these three. Plus, I believe their test is not quite as accurate and is not going to give you as accurate results ethnicity-wise and all of that. If you're looking for an autosomal test, what I would recommend doing is going with either Ancestry or 23andMe, and then uploading your results to Family Tree DNA or MyHeritage, because I do believe MyHeritage does allow you to upload raw data files. Now, I would recommend going with these two and uploading there, because, you know, you're going to get the advantages of the large databases of 23andMe and Ancestry, and then all the other, plus the databases of these two. Now, a caveat on that. 23andMe's newest version is the V5 chip, and it's great because it's a lot more accurate than their previous version, which is awesome because it gives more information and all of that. But the current V5 chip for 23andMe is not compatible with third-party uploads or Family Tree DNA or MyHeritage. That's a problem for right now. Hopefully, eventually, they will update their systems to be able to handle the V5 chip. But the alternative is GEDmatch, and GEDmatch won't take the V5 chip. However, they have a program on GEDmatch called Genesis, and if you choose Genesis, you can upload there with your 23andMe kit. The only issue is that the Genesis is a much smaller database than the overall GEDmatch. All right, so let's move on because I've talked about that enough. So So the next kind of DNA test is mitochondrial DNA test, and this is the DNA that you got from your mother's mother's mother's, and she does pass it down to her sons, but sons cannot pass it down to their children. So it goes mother, 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 and we can see that by the fact that we don't have this circle, the great grandmother here. We don't have her lit up here with the red, and that's because her son, while he got her mitochondrial DNA, he did not pass it down to his daughter. So this goes from your mother's 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 all the way back to mitochondrial Eve, and so the main companies that test for this are Family Tree DNA and 23andMe. Now, like I said, 23andMe will just give you a base level, and it's certainly helpful. It's good to know what the base level is, but they don't run as many SNPs as Family Tree DNA does. Now, Family Tree DNA, they have, I believe, just one test for mitochondrial, and but it's much, much, much more in depth. And it is a separate test than the autosomal test, whereas 23andMe, their mitochondrial and their Y DNA test is part of the autosomal one. So they only test a few sections of that of the chromosome there. Family Tree DNA will do a much more in-depth test, and it's a separate test, which means it's a lot more expensive. So, and I believe the autosomal test for Family Tree DNA is about the same price as the 23andMe autosomal test. I believe it's like $79, whereas 23andMe is $99. But the mitochondrial DNA test for Family Tree DNA is $100-something, so it's more expensive. So that's the mitochondrial. It's not going to, for our purposes here, mitochondrial DNA is not going to be too helpful, because we are trying to find the father side, which is Y DNA tests, and that's heavily associated with surname projects. So what's a surname project? A surname project is, basically what it says, tracking surnames. And it's much more helpful to use Y DNA tests for surname projects versus mitochondrial DNA tests, because of the nature of our societies in general across the globe. I mean, of course, not every society has been like this, but most have, where the surname goes from the father to children to a wife takes husband's name, passes on to their children. That tends to be how surnames have progressed through time, and since the creation of surnames. So again, Family Tree DNA and 23andMe are the main companies that are going to provide you with your Y DNA haplogroup, if you're male, of course. If you're not male, such as in my case, you can hope that one of your male line relatives will take the test or have taken the test. In my case, I will, my dad is testing with 23andMe, so we will get a base level Y haplogroup from him, but I'm also planning on getting him one of the Y DNA tests from Family Tree DNA for Christmas, so that'll be a while from now, but that'll give us a much more in-depth haplogroup, and it'll look at the mutations a lot more, and it'll look at a lot more SNPs and other genealogical, genetic technical words. Yeah, like I said, though, family tree DNA is a much more in-depth test, and they actually have a lot of different Y-DNA tests. It's not just one separate from the autosomal. They have like 4 other Y-DNA tests. So I'm actually going to explore that here. So, Y-DNA. So, 23andMe will give you a base level Y haplogroup, and it's cheap because it's grouped in with their autosomal test. So it's $99 retail. You can usually get it for cheaper. They do have sales. So just, if you want to wait until there's a sale, then wait for a sale. So while the autosomal test for 23andMe will definitely give you a sort of will give you connections with close relatives, it's not going to pinpoint Y haplogroup relatives in the same way that that family tree DNA will do, because it gives you a very base level haplogroup, which can be helpful, and that's why I'm also glad that my dad will be testing with 23andMe, because we will get a base level haplogroup from him, which can definitely help us out if any of the male line descendants of the other Helmers happen to test and they find out their haplogroup. We can eliminate some of them if that ends up being the case. But it's not going to connect us. It's going to be much more distant. It's going to be a more distant sort of connection, like people that we share a haplogroup with from 30 generations ago that we don't even share DNA with anymore. So then there's family tree DNA, which I think is, if you want to get a Y-DNA test or a mitochondrial DNA test, an in-depth one, family tree DNA is the way to go. So they have high-level tests, Y37, where they look at 37 SNPs or STRs. I don't know the correct term. So the cheapest one they look at, which is $169 retail, they look at 37. I believe, I'm not 100% sure, but I believe they look at 12 on the 23andMe. And then there's the Y67, which is $268, Y111, which is $359, and Y500, that's their big Y. It is $649. It is like insanely expensive. However, they do have sales frequently. So I'm thinking that when I'm watching closely for sales from Family Tree DNA, and when they have a big sale, I will probably get my dad either the Y37 or Y67 for Christmas. So that'll be a nice big Christmas present there. We could also potentially get it for my grandfather instead. However, I think my dad wanted to have all of the information that an autosomal test would give us. So it's possible my dad will get my grandpa the 23andMe, in which case my dad can have either the Y37 or the Y67. And what's great about this too is that if we're still not finding connections on the lower level ones here, you can upgrade your thing on Family Tree DNA, your test, and because they keep the samples, so they'll just run it through and test the excess SNPs or whatever. So the great thing about Family Tree DNA, along with the fact that they test these high, much higher level testing for Y-DNA, surname projects. So what are the surname projects? I kind of covered it in the previous slide, but basically that's, researching surnames and where they come from, and where they started, and it's very interesting to watch people who are getting their results from their Y-DNA tests, because when they get their very, very detailed haplogroup, it does very much narrow down some surnames. So you'll go on the list and see the other people who tested the same detailed haplogroup as you, and you'll notice that there's a lot of groupings of surnames, and indicating that your very detailed haplogroup is associated with a certain surname, and that can be extremely helpful if we're looking for an adoption case like this, if we're looking for missing parents of of an adopted child. So that, and it also gives you a very good chance of connecting with the closer relatives that share your haplogroup. Whereas 23andMe, you're going to connect with people who you don't even share any actual DNA with. They're tens and tens of generations apart from you. They just happen to have the same general haplogroup. But a much more detailed haplogroup, you're going to connect with closer relatives. So that brings us to the problem with surname projects and Swedish surnames. So the surname projects are going to be extremely helpful, because that's where we're going to see groupings of surnames. And if we see a large chunk of the surnames of the Helmers, like Bachman or Lindberg or even Henderson, it's going to give us a good idea of, it's going to give us an extremely strong idea of which one is actually the father. But Scandinavian surnames are patrilineal. And what does that mean? That means that Gustav Anderson is the son of Anders Johansson, who's the son of Johan Olafsson, who's the son of Olaf blah, 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 blah. You see my issue here. This is something that's very common in the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, and Iceland is, they still have this going on. Now, not all of them are end in son or daughter, because, for the females, it's, it would be Anders' daughter or Johan's daughter or Olaf's daughter, etc. Not all of the surnames end like that. And lucky for us, Bachman and Lindberg don't end in a son or a daughter. So that's actually very helpful. However, when it's unknown when those surnames were taken on. They may have been taken on pretty early. I mean late, pretty late on in the generations, and so we may still see a bunch of sons and daughters ending surnames, and that can be an issue when researching Scandinavian surname projects. Now the plus side to that is that the people you're going to connect with, you're going to be able to, they're probably very much going to want to, the people who are doing these surname projects, they're doing them to help. So a lot of them will be very much open to going through their family trees and responding to emails and responding to questions. So there's still a very good chance that we could narrow down the father that way. And the practice, this practice of the surname changing every generation, it mostly stopped in Sweden in the past 100 years or so. There are still some who continue the practice, but it's pretty much done. And a lot of people are even changing their names to not end in son or daughter, specifically because there are so many of them in Sweden. Iceland, like I said, I believe still does the patrilineal naming, where each name changes every generation. But yeah, so this is, I'm excited for this, but it is going to take a long time. So what's the next steps here? So what we got to do is continue fishing in the autosomal pools, and that includes getting permission from some relatives who have already tested, and asking them if I could have access to their relative matches, you know. And we can also ask the descendants of Mr. Bachman and Mr. Lindberg to test, either autosomal testing or Y-DNA testing. I would probably ask them to just test with the autosomal testing, just because it's going to be, we would probably match with a lot of them. If now with the Bachmans, because there's no there's so few relative or descendants, if we're looking for the male line, we would have to go to Mr. Bachman's the descendants of his siblings, or the descendants of his his aunts and uncles and stuff, or his cousins, we would have to ask that, and if that's the case, there's a much less likely chance that we're going to connect with them, because they're so far back. In that case, I would prefer to find a male line descendant and ask them to take a simple Y-DNA test through family tree DNA. And now with the Lindbergs, there's so many of them. There are tons of them. So I'm hoping I could ask one of them. But I mean, the whole thing is, these DNA tests are expensive, and I'd be asking a complete stranger to, swab their cheek or spit in a tube, which is a little weird, and, so that's kind of an awkward thing to ask people you've never known, or you don't even know. Hey, can you take a DNA test, because I want to see if, your great-grandfather fathered my great-grandfather. Now, the other thing we can do is wait for the Y-DNA test results to come back. And like I said, I haven't even ordered this yet. And I'm going to be watching for sales big time. And if a big sale comes around, then that's going to be my dad's Christmas present. And hopefully before Christmas time, we'll get some results for that. But yeah. So I've tried to make this short, but I think this went on really long, and I do apologize for that. I'm trying to make these shorter, but so that leaves part 4 up in the air, because right now that's where we're at. We've exhausted all of our knowledge right now of the Helmers, the possible fathers of Vernon Helmer Scott. I still have to get in touch with a lot of the descendants, especially from the Lindberg side. I haven't talked to any of them, so they're completely in the dark about this, about my journey here. Everything's just so up in the air right now. And a lot of it's waiting on test results, and waiting until family tree DNA goes on a big sale. So, but I'm not going to stop making some genealogical videos in the meantime. It just probably won't be about this particular mystery here. I'll probably do some videos in the next weeks or so about just some funny anecdotes and stories of some of my ancestors, some funny articles, or interesting things we found. So I'm excited to share that with you, and thanks for sticking around, and I hope to have the next part of this up sooner rather than later, but we'll see. All right, thanks for sticking around, guys. Later, learners. Bye.